Again, thank you all so much for coming out. With you tonight, but we're mighty. I think we've got, as you can see, the work that we're doing in our communities is critical, but more importantly, we're leveraging some critical talent to get that work accomplished. So right now, we're going to begin our panel. Before we give our panel, Maynard Anderson to say a few words, and then we'll come down and introduce our panel to everyone and go from there.
I have to keep the schedule here, or Elliot will be unhappy with me. But thank you for being here. I think there's one administrative note that I need to ask, and that is turn off your cell phone, please, while you're in the auditorium. The title of the panel is Creating Veteran Pipelines into Civic Solutions. That means to me that we have to find creative, innovative, and imaginative ways to answer veterans' problems and issues. And in fulfilling the missions of Leave No Veteran Behind, one of which you saw on the screen, we invest in veterans, we employ veterans' talents and their skills to deal with issues and try to make those unique capabilities improve their communities, improve society, improve their business involvement, and improve their own lives. The Leave No Veteran Behind model is innovative, and it exemplifies that investment in veterans. But it also stimulates synergies among the various programs which deal with veterans' educational debt, transitional employment, training, all of which deal with youth violence, school safety, youth training in science and technology, and a number of other things that we're looking at every day. These activities create value. They create value in terms of service to our constituents. There is real value in bringing people together to talk about and address the needs of veterans in the environments in which they live and work. So thank you to the panelists who are here tonight. Thank you to the sponsors who made this possible today. And thank you, to the attendees who I suspect will contribute to the conclusions of the panel. If you don't, we'll take names and ask questions. Let me introduce the panelists. First, Rosie B. Cloud, who is the Senior Advisor for Veterans Employment, Acting Director, Office of Transition, Employment, and Economic Impact of the Department of Veterans Affairs. She's second in line. Justin Ford, General Manager, Dog Tag Incorporated, first in line. Abdul Henderson, who is the Executive Director of the Congressional Black Caucus. And at the end of the table, Dana Hendrickson, Director, Outreach and Advocacy of the Maryland Department of Veterans Affairs. The moderator will be Eli Williamson, who you all know, and you have the chair, Mr. Williamson.
All right, so first things, I try to start off with the moderator's prerogative, and Rosie, she asked a very good question earlier today. She says, well, what do you hope to get out of this panel? And so I'll start with my first question, easily making a statement, right? But the response that I want from the folks on the panel in response to this will allow you to learn who they are and what some of their responsibilities are. So when we look at this panel, there are two sides. There's the conversation around veterans as civic assets, that veterans have some skills that people need. And then there's the other side, and I say, well, civic assets and understanding that we are civic assets are one component. Understanding that we have civic solutions is the other component, because that's the activation of those assets, right? That's us saying that, hey, I'm coming back into my community, and I've got some very specific things that I want to accomplish that will not only improve the life that I have, the life of my family, but the life of those around me. And so each one of these individuals who's on the panel today has had some experience on both of those sides. One, showing that veterans are civic assets, and two, showing that veterans can come up with some very unique solutions. So for each panelist, and this is more of a opportunity for you all. Can you talk about a narrative or story that explains what you do and how what you do straddles both identifying veterans as assets within your component of work, and then also opportunities that those veterans have shown to provide actual civic solutions for some very specific problems that may face the demographics that you actually work with. Being a gentleman, I would love to start with Dana, if that's possible, and then we would go from there.
Thank you. On behalf of Maryland Governor Larry Hogan and the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Affairs, George Owings, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening, and I guess I should turn my, is this on?
You bring it a little bit closer.
Should I yell? I am very blessed to serve as the Director of Outreach for the Maryland Department of Veterans Affairs, and I've actually been in this position for only about a year and a half now. Prior to that, I served as a regional resource coordinator for a program called Maryland's Commitment to Veterans, which was a behavioral health initiative under the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene for the state of Maryland. Prior to that, I guess you could say I was just the run-of-the-mill military spouse. I've never served in the military, but at times I feel like I have, after 4 deployments to Iraq that my husband experienced. I'm very blessed, again, to be in this role because it really affords me the opportunity to get face-to-face with our veterans, whether they are our post 9/11 veterans, whether they are our Vietnam era or our World War II veterans. And when I think about assets, I think about all of the remarkable skills that our veterans come out of the military with. And oftentimes when I talk with veterans, they say, you know, it makes me a little uncomfortable when I'm referred to as a hero, because all I was really doing was my job. And if given the opportunity, I would go back and do the very same thing that I was doing all over again, despite the risk. And that mere spirit of service to self is something that we need to pay careful consideration to, and we need to be able to leverage, because our veterans come out of the military with incredible skill sets that we need to pay attention to, such as being able to build teams, being able to work out logistics. I had the incredible opportunity within my role as Director of Outreach to meet with a gentleman from Team Rubicon yesterday who talks about how they use the skills that our veterans come out of the military with. They leverage them to be able to respond and provide relief in response to natural disasters. I mean, that is absolutely incredible, and it's all volunteer. They're not getting fiscally reimbursed to do those things. You know, when I think about solutions, you know, as far as logistics and operations and IT and technology, you know, these skill sets that our veterans have are absolutely remarkable. I think about what happened in Baltimore. You know, it's right up the street from where I live. I watched it on the news, and then I went back up to Baltimore about a week after what happened, and I drove past the headquarters for the Baltimore City Police, and I saw the National Guard there deployed. And it was very surreal for me. But as far as coming up with solutions to civic issues, we had an interesting conversation with some leaders in Baltimore about how we can start to give back and repair Baltimore. And there was someone there from Big Brothers Big Sisters, and she was begging for volunteers. And I said to her, give me your information. We will send it out to our veterans, because of that spirit to serve and that spirit to give back and put service before self. Is something, you know, that we might be able to leverage to help you find mentors for the youth in Baltimore City. So I think that I'm in this remarkable position within my role to be able to have those conversations with organizations and veterans about the assets, and as well as, you know, the solutions that they can bring to make our communities healthier.
Excellent, excellent. So throughout this, I have to update you all on some of the impact of leaving no veteran behind, and if I don't, Maynard will be very upset at me. So one of our biggest partnerships in the city of Chicago is we've actually placed about 20 veterans with Big Brothers Big Sisters. That's one of our outcomes of our program, is placement into jobs. And so one of the things, and I want to, now we've talked a little bit about placement into jobs in the job front, I would love to hear, Justin, a little bit about your work, and then talk about how do you straddle this component of civic assets and civic solutions.
Sure. My name's Justin Ford. A long time ago, I was an airborne combat engineer out of Fort Bragg. I deployed to Kosovo and Iraq. I am currently the general manager of Dog Tag Bakery, Inc. And I know you're probably thinking, what does a bakery have to do with veterans? When I first went to apply for the job, I thought the same thing. And then I got creative and slept on it and figured this is something I should do. So what we do, We have a true work-study program, and there aren't a lot of those out there. Generally, there's an academic side or there's an applied side, but there aren't really that many work-study programs out there. And we have a upscale retail bakery in Georgetown where we sell, everything from, freshly baked breads to sandwiches to desserts to cakes, you name it. We also do wholesale. We also do online. A little pitch for dog tag. Within the first 6 months of within the first 8 months of our organization, we created 8 wholesale accounts from 5 military grocery stores and have an online store. And we did that by the use of...
That's an applause.
But we did that by the use of a veteran military family volunteer force. I certainly didn't do it by myself. There was only a couple of us that started the initiative. And the other piece we have is a academic program that's a business fundamentals certificate through Georgetown University. And it's the same business fundamentals certificate that anyone else would take if they went to Georgetown. And we teach finance, accounting, communications, business management, you name it. So the idea is they take a certificate program over the course of 5 months. They sit down with me 3 days a week. I go over profit and loss statements. I go over labor statements. I go over inventory, HR, hiring, staffing. So they're learning in the classroom and then they're coming back and doing it in the bakery itself. So the bakery is a conduit to teach them small business management. Before that, I was a leadership development director for the Truman National Security Project. I started a program called the Defense Council. And the Defense Council was a veteran defense led organization that got veterans in a place where they were working on policy, either nonprofit work or political work, and it was a way for them to give back. And actually several people in the audience were part of that program, and it's something that's became quite a large organization, even a much larger network. And just to cap it off, there's probably hundreds of public service stories that I could give, but one that's a recent public service story at Dog Tag, we had a sergeant major that came in that was an 82nd guy, so I liked him a little bit more than everybody else. And he was a lot bigger and stronger than me, and he's a sergeant major, so of course he tries to punk me. And I punk him back and hold my ground, and we developed a really good relationship over the course of the 5 months. And what we realized was, although he was dealing with things like traumatic brain injury, severe post-traumatic stress disorder, multiple back and physical disabilities, that he still had a voice and he still had something to give back to the community. And he's now a motivational speaker. And some of the things we did to help him along the path, he said, I just want to go back, I don't care about money. And I said, you need to put it in your savings account or at least put it back in the organization. So we got him properly filled out as a private entity. He now has an actual business. We created a network. General Dempsey is now his mentor. And he's been doing ongoing public speaking engagements since he left the program. So there's no reason why that sergeant major can't continue to be a sergeant major and motivating individuals throughout this country, and he's doing a great job. And the last thing I'll say is I think we're at a pivotal point where the old model, and I know some people in the room may hate me for this, but the old model, the traditional VSO and bars and this big structure, this bureaucracy, I think is going by the wayside. Organizations like Leave No Veteran Behind, Team Rubicon, Team Red, White, and Blue, public service organizations that not only talk about the things that we're faced with, but also talk about the things we can do and actually go out there and do it, I think is the way of the future. I'm really honored to be here, so thank you.
Excellent. I want to speak with Rosie, and you're with the VA, and so the VA gets daggers pretty much from everybody. I imagine there's a vet here who's thrown the dagger at the VA, right? But one of the things that we don't do, and this is something that the VA I think struggles with, is highlighting those success stories of people at the end of that pipeline, right? When you do get that veteran, that level of support. Rosie's been instrumental in the Chicagoland area of engaging with our community. That's something I think the VA has been very serious about. So Rosie, if you can talk just a little bit, right, you know, from the time that somebody gets into the VA the right way, they're getting the service supports that they need, what are some of those outcomes when it comes to everything from people being able to purchase homes, people do all those other things that really and truly impact the community, and what does that end result look like for the VA when we start talking about civic assets and also civic solutions? You know, paint us that VA picture if possible.
Eli, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit about that today. And you're right. I mean, certainly a lot of time and attention is spent on where we can do better as a VA. And so it's nice to take a little pause and talk about some of the great work that men and women across the country get to do on behalf of our nation's veterans. We talked a little bit about my program, so whether it's transition, employment, or economic impact, you know, one of the pieces that I would say is probably instrumental from a VA perspective is being able to leverage scale and information and actually share that across the country. Surely it is no surprise to anyone in this room the fact that by and large veterans persist, achieve, and do wonderfully out in the economy, and that narrative is sometimes supported by the VA, whether it's purchasing a home, creating some stabilization in communities. But then during the transition process, you know, our initial contact really begins in starting that information flow, talking about what is the art of the possible. And we have benefits advisors over the last 2 years in the new transition assistance program where for the first time, Department of Labor, the VA, and DOD actually get to engage with a transitioning service member before they leave the active duty military. And it is a wonderful honor to be able to do that before they transition from service because we're able to provide information and resources that become powerful tools, frankly, where the veteran, the new soon-to-be veteran, is in the driver's seat about leveraging them. All of these are benefits that they've earned. None of them are a handout. These are all tools like home loan guarantee, insurance, you know, the access to the 5 years of health care upon transition, and then obviously some employment tools and partnerships that we have. We currently, in looking at kind of the 9/11 generation as a whole, published a report on economic outcomes, and this generation, I mean, by and large, is outperforming the general population when they connect to competitive employment. So the desire for us to increase those opportunities as soon as possible is just tremendous. I would say, if not one of the most powerful tools, still becomes the 9/11 GI Bill. So we have truly doubled down in trying to get the information out to all service members and veterans about the power of the GI Bill. I think not only has it been a strong recruitment and retention tool, it is an amazing transition tool. Here you have hundreds of thousands of dollars available as far as a resource in the hip pocket of a transition service member to redesign their destiny, to create a new narrative about their goals, their future, and frankly, I don't think our country can afford to not tap into that talent, to not tap into that potential. And when I joined the job a year and a half ago, one of my first questions was how many use it and how many don't. And when I realized that over 50% of our veterans will never use their GI Bill, will actually allow it to expire without ever touching that, I saw that, frankly, as a call to action. And so we are extremely interested in going to cities. We've been to Chicago. We've been, across the country in our major areas to really get the word out about the flexibility of the GI Bill, its potential for things more than just 2- and 4-year institutions, to be able to do things like apprenticeships and on-the-job training, because we know that one of the biggest precursors for folks never using the GI Bill is if they never went to college while on active duty and they've never actually come from a home that's actually persisted in education. And so we want to make sure that that coaching and counseling happens so that those types of opportunities don't get pushed by the wayside, because you don't have to have a 2- or 4-year degree to actually have a great path into the middle class here in America. And so that has been one of the major areas. We touch about 250,000 service members every year during our transition assistance programs. We touch about 1 million veterans a month in our employment programs, which I think is also a story that isn't told very often. We have partnerships with over 6,000 employers. We have a website called the Veterans Employment Center with 2 million jobs and a whole bunch of other opportunities that are wrapped around it through public-private partnerships. And about 1 million veterans visit it, use it to actually help connect to their job hunt and their opportunity. Just some basic statistics. I mean, for the 9/11 generation, up until about a year ago, about 1 out of 2 veterans actually transitioned into a period of unemployment. And I found that to be quite alarming. And while that trend has changed, the good news is the narrative shouldn't be our veterans aren't motivated to work, because the data also showed that all of them will connect to a job before unemployment actually runs out. They all run towards employment. They all run towards productive, members of society. 95% of them will actually fall well before their unemployment eligibility actually runs out. And that's the story I really want to tell, a story about our women veterans who actually graduated higher rates than male veterans by about 10%. And the fact that every single 9/11 generation veteran, regardless of age, regardless of gender, will actually outperform the general population head on the moment they connect to competitive employment. And so we think there's a powerful story to tell. It's less about the VA and more about just the grit and determination of our veterans, and how we take on the challenge of making sure that all the tools and benefits they've earned become available and are part of them taking that driver's seat to create a new destiny. So I'm so glad to be here.
All right,
Thank you.
excellent. I think everybody who's married got that last point, that women are still smarter than men, 100% of even in the military side. So Abdul, we had a really interesting conversation at dinner. You were with the Congressional Black Caucus, and we talked about how these issues are fundamentally, are change, right? Depending on where you transition to, and everything from your demographic has impact on that. I think everybody's talked on the panel so far about kind of the structural issues, whether it be organizational, whether it be governmental, whether it be municipal or state. If you can, as a veteran, right, talk about the moment in which you decided that you wanted to continue to serve in your new role, right, and what that looks like, and how these issues, specifically veterans at Civic Assets and veterans who hope to create Civic Solutions, how that plays out with you as an individual.
Well, first I would like to say thank you for the invitation. I know mostly everyone here except for Dana, but I appreciate the work that Justin, Rosie, and Dana do. They are on the front lines of the fight for veterans. I was there. I was at VA for 2.5 years till I left in January to go back to the Hill to take my current position. And so I understand the issues that they deal with on a daily basis, and it was an honor to serve under Secretary Shinseki and Secretary McDonald, who were striving to provide a better way for veterans, and have done great work. So just in my case, for me, I kind of always grew up in a public service household. Coming from Los Angeles, my father was engaged civically. He was in a revolutionary movement for the fight for justice in the 60s, and so it's kind of where my name kind of is inspired from. And so I've always been involved in some kind of public engagement. However, my dad was able to provide a better life for me than he had. And so when I got to a point of growing up, and I was just like, what do I want to do as a young man, as a man? I was just like, well, let me join the Marines. All my family was in the Army, and so I chose the Marine option. And actually, that ended up working out best for me. I think it was what I needed at the time. And how that translates is that, I went from someone who was, I believe I was smart, but I wasn't necessarily prepared for college, nor had I really had the structure of, how to set a plan from one point and then getting to a conclusion and finishing that. And I could say after the Marines, after I came out of boot camp, that all changed for me. It helped develop and put me in a position to be able to complete something. How to strategically think, how to, take a group of people and lead them to a desired end. And so as, post my Marine Corps career, and then I went back home, and I was still involved in my community, but somehow I got pulled into this national scope. Just like it wasn't necessarily something I planned for, but it just kind of happened. And I think people recognize that based upon the leadership that the Marines had taught me. And so one thing that I notice when people gravitate towards people in the military is that people in the military are natural leaders. The military trains you to be a leader. They train you to find a way out of no way. And what people can use that for and leveraging that today for veterans is that, you know, they see veterans as an asset. And I think everyone has talked about that in some form or fashion, is that when you see a veteran, you know that this person has been trained by the best country in the world. They know how to work together in teams, whether they're large or small. They know how to utilize resources and use them well. They understand efficiency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so people in the community, I would say sometimes don't recognize that because it's hard. I think sometimes it's hard for people to look past the hero part, because they're so happy that you are able to achieve and do something that most people can't do. You know, you're looking at a country of 315 million people, and 1% of the country wears the uniform. So most people, I think it's hard for them to identify past the hero part, because it's like, man, you actually would do something that I was not able to do. But then also I think another part that is kind of an issue is, how do we as veterans translate what we are able to do into a language that everyone understands? And I think that is a challenge for all of us, even for myself, even to this day. Like, I love VA for one part because it was all people who spoke my language. It's just like, you know, all these acronyms, whatnot. And so we can we understand it, but when we go into the civilian world, and even with my time on the House, like I talk in ways and do things in ways that people just don't relate to. It's because, you know, the training is different. However, despite all that, you know, veterans have always been a quintessential part of the American fabric. It's just that we as veterans have to organize to show people, you know, what our skill set is. And sometimes, you know, I've heard a lot of people say in the past that, you know, I think it's even written in your document, is that, you know, veterans aren't charity cases, and we aren't. You know, veterans are very strong, very humble people, and part of the problem, even with the VA sometimes, is actually getting veterans to actually access and utilize their benefits, because a lot of cases veterans feel that, you know, like, oh, like, I don't need anything from the government. I served, I did my part, and let me go on about my life. And so, you know, it's up for the veteran community to kind of do things that are out of the box, like what Eli is doing, and then everyone will recognize the value of veterans. But we have to do it in a way that, you know, the masses can also understand.
Excellent. So one of the things, and I try to throw things at panelists, so forgive me. Each one of you represent a very interesting demographic. And so one of the things about representing a demographic when you're in a job is that you find yourself speaking for them, right? And so one of the things when you find yourself speaking for folk, you find yourself having to change the narrative or change the assumptions that people make. So, you know, I'll start and just throw out, you know, 1 or 2 minutes of a response. If there is a misconception based on what you normally do, right? What is that misconception, and then how does that misconception frustrate you within your job? And Dana, if you can cover that. You're a military spouse, and that's like, you know, I one aside, if there's anybody we need to give like a round of applause to, the military is like fun for guys and gals in the military, but for the spouses and kids and otherwise, it can be absolute hell. And so, you know, Dana, if you could talk about misconception, military spouse, what that usual misconception is and how that frustrates you, and very briefly. And I'm gonna circle back around. So,
and speaking specifically to my service as a spouse, prior to me resigning to be a stay-at-home mom, when my husband was deployed the first time, I had close to 10 years working in corrections. And our leadership at the detention center at the time had told me, as well as a few other folks, that we were essentially the leaders. We were going to be the future leaders of our center. And that felt great. I was just finishing up my graduate degree. And I thought I was going to have this lifelong career in county government, coming beyond, past my parents who had served in county government for over 30 years. And I think that there's this misconception of the military spouse as being the stay-at-home parent wearing yoga pants, watching soap operas in a dirty house, and the kids are running around in diapers. I mean, that's kind of the idea, the mom that is just praying to be able to take a shower before dinner. And it is so far removed from the truth. I just spoke at an event last week, specifically speaking to HR professionals as it relates to the skill sets that both veterans and military spouses bring to the table. And I talked about the challenges that I had and the fear that I had when I was preparing to go back into the workplace. And I was given an incredible opportunity with the position that I was given a year and a half ago. And the interesting thing is that I was offered the job while my husband was deployed. And I thought, oh my gosh, this employer is not going to want me because my husband's on the other side of the world and we have 2 small children. How am I going to make this work? But they were flexible enough. But as far as what military spouses bring to the table when it comes to civic involvement, their degree of volunteer service is absolutely incredible. We lived off base, so I wasn't particularly engaged on the Fort Meade base where my husband was stationed. But everything that I've heard as far as the enlisted wives spouses and the officers' wives spouses and the food drives and all of the incredible things that they do, and they're doing it as a volunteer, they're not getting fiscally paid. They're not bringing home a paycheck to do this, but they believe in it. And as far as skill sets in a workplace, fiscal management, accounting, budgeting, logistics when you have children, getting them to school, getting them to sports, getting them to doctor's appointments, managing the household. Sometimes I feel like that's managing a small business. That's being an administrator. So I think that there's this misconception for spouses, whether it's a father who's the spouse, or a husband who's the spouse, or a mother or a wife who's the spouse, that, again, we sit at home and eat bonbons and wear yoga pants. That's so far from the truth. So I think that's a common misconception that I would really appreciate being able to blow out of the water.
All right, so no one here watches Army Wives, right? Just make sure. So, we'll stay on this, this role of misconceptions. Justin, you and I talk about this often. We were enlisted guys, right? And there's this thematic scenario, right, where people have this view of the military being this like World War I or World War II type military. So if you can cover down this, misconceptions that you may get, right, when you put in that resume, when people are looking at your talent base and you can't explain to somebody what a sergeant major is or does because that's not part of the dialogue. I mean, and I'm totally like leading you, so just know.
Yeah. Well, I would say there's certainly a lot of misconceptions, not only with enlisted, but also with the military. When you look at a lot of the major companies, i.e. a lot of the major banks in New York, they have officer recruiting programs, but they don't have enlisted recruiting programs. And that's something you fail to hear from a lot of these organizations, but that's the truth. They're recruiting from a very small segment of the United States military. Often the people that need the most transitional help, i.e. the people that were grunts, combat engineers like myself, or infantry, or people that served on the front lines, often are recruited the least. They're often on the commercials and the people that you're looking at when they ask for money, but they're not often the people the resources flow to. So I just want to point that, it just came to mind. It always upsets me, so I just let it go real quick. But, what I wanted to talk about was disabilities, specifically post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injuries, and some of the hidden wounds that many of our veterans face. And quite often, not only employers, but the general public are almost scared, and sometimes they are scared. And I've been in rooms when they're military friendly or even veteran-led organizations where they said, I don't know about hiring this guy. He's got PTSD, and he may be a little unhinged. And I got to tell you, I've been working with people with PTSD, and we all have our struggles, and I've never once had an issue that couldn't be resolved by working out, by talking through an issue, by taking care of yourself, by taking care of your employees, the same thing you would do with anyone else. So I think so often these disabilities are actually overblown to be something they're not. And I know people in very high positions of power within the United States government that have PTSD. I come from a trailer park. Some of those people have PTSD, and they still go to work every day. So I want us to be a little less afraid, more open, and I think it's something that people need to become more accepting of. Although somebody might be a little more aware, a little more fidgety, doesn't mean they're less determined or have the inability to accomplish the job.
Excellent. So Abdul, right now you've been on the VA side, you've been on the military side, and now you're on the congressional side, right? And we start talking about some of the frustrations that we have around narratives. And so if there's a narrative that you think, I'll start using the word poisonous, right? For people being able to view veterans as both assets and view veterans as if they have solutions to some very specific problems in our community, what would be some of the things that you think we would need to be able to identify as a narrative that needs to go away, and what's the counter narrative?
Before I answer that one, there's one thing. I think for me, I have a unique experience. Prior to when I first came to DC, I worked for a member of the House out of Los Angeles, my hometown. And I rose through the ranks in her office to ultimately become her chief of staff before she retired. And so when I worked for her, I had her military veterans portfolio. So my first look at the VA was from the oversight role. And, based upon what I would read in the paper versus what I would read in statute, I thought I knew VA, and I thought I knew how to regulate VA. And then we would pass legislation or fight for particular things and fight with the secretary from the oversight role to implement change, thinking that we knew what we were doing from the oversight role. So flip side, when I end up at VA and I actually start to learn how large VA actually is, and all of the bureaucratic processes of VA, and all of the redundancy that is passed through legislation, I realized I didn't know much about VA as someone who was supposed to provide oversight over the agency. So I think one major common misperception is that people who regulate federal agencies know what they're actually talking about. And so I say that, not as any friends of my current position, who has to advise 46 members of Congress, but I say that just someone who has experienced, the congressional, the agency, and back on the congressional side. And one thing I would say, I think a solution to some of the VA's problems is that I think they should adopt a program with something similar that DOD does, is that they actually embed their legislative folks within member offices to where they work, a few months out of the year to, get to know the committee staff, et cetera. And it works out very well for DOD. And so that's a common misconception. The other thing, and I want to focus on it, is what Justin says in terms of common misconceptions, is the issue of mental health. You know, I come from a city that has basically been in a civil war for decades, and that's how, and I use that term because, you know, when you have, you know, people in the same community killing each other, essentially, in my opinion, for nothing, and those deaths, you know, rack up over the years more than what we've had currently in our two current conflicts. It's a civil war. And so I've lived around more post-traumatic stress growing up through high school than I did in combat. I lost more friends in high school than I did when I deployed to Iraq in 2003. And so the common misperception in terms of mental health is that it's only a veteran issue, and it's not. You know, when you look at the U.S. in terms of the issue of suicide, it's not just a veteran issue. When you look at the demographic between 18 to 55, one of the top 4 causes of death among the general population is suicide. And then, you know, the Defense Department has to recruit out of this population that has a high propensity to suicide, and then they join, and then you put them into the most stressful situation known to man, which is war. And then you put them back into a strenuous situation of life, depending on where you go. If you go back to LA or Chicago or Baltimore or the Bronx, Brooklyn, you know, what do you end up with in a lot of cases? So I think a common misconception on mental health is that it's just a veteran issue. It's an epidemic problem in the U.S. that we need to address overall. I know that's not what you asked me about, but I just wanted to share those things because there are serious issues that we have to look at.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is, you know, one of the things, and this is, you know, moderator's priority here, and one of the things I think is critical, this is kind of my last, you know, dog in the fight, is that I don't believe we should engage personally veterans for veterans' sake. I believe that by engaging with veterans issues, we're actually solving issues for the larger community. So if we are able to successfully engage around post-traumatic stress with this demographic, then on the streets of Chicago, when we're engaging with these youth, we can engage with them in a much more proactive way. I had a veteran call me up because he saw our work with our youth, and we've provided mentorship, direct mentorship to over 200 youth in the city of Chicago, and about 40 veterans have been doing that work in the last 3 years. And this individual said, you know, Eli, and he was a Caucasian male, and he says, Eli, you know, it bothers me that whenever a veteran does something, whether they're part of a shooting or something happens, the first question is, were they in combat? Did they serve? Did they see something traumatic that would influence their behavior? He says, I find it strange that we have all these kids who grow up, like myself, like this gentleman, who've seen really awful levels of violence in our own communities, and no one asks these kids who may commit some type of crime, has their experience influenced any aspect of their behavior? And I think that that's a national tragedy, right? Especially because these are persistent environments. We deploy overseas and come back and have to deal with the after effects. But what do you say to a kid? All of our team has dealt with children who come into environments of hostility and violence and then come to our program and then have to return to those environments. And so this is, you know, it's right on topic. You know, Rosie, you know, one of the things, you know, and I, you know, again, everybody here can throw daggers at the VA. I've thrown my own, right? But one of the things, and we start talking about misperceptions about the VA, and you brought up probably one of the most salient ones, and I try to like do action items. I think that's a good idea. Some VA embed at the congressional level, where you have VA people explaining to congressional representatives what the VA does and how it works. But what are some of the misconceptions, and pick a very specific one that hinders your ability to get things done in communities, because people just don't know how it works, right? And if you can just cover down on that topic, Rosie, I'd be very appreciative.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate the framing of, you know, are some of these issues America issues or veteran issues, and how do we kind of work through that? I mean, from a barriers perspective, I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions within the VA as folks talk about the major transformation that needs to happen with the VA, and talking about it as an organizational breakdown. And you know, I go back to when you say that, you really mean people, right? And so when you're talking about a people breakdown, the ripple effect that can have when the folks, let's say, that work on my issue areas across the globe, I mean, 93% of them are veterans or military spouses, right? And I think we don't talk about that enough, that of the millions that I talked about that are touched on any given month, you know, 93% of them, 33% of them are female veterans. I mean, twice the demographic. And so these are folks that are serving still, right? And so when you're trying to transform an organization and attract great talent, you know, being able to really recognize the type, you know, who you're talking about, right? And making sure that we're being issue and fact-based versus just generalizing. In my space in particular, an issue area that I think is a barrier is there's just a lot of misconception when we say employment transition, who we're talking about. We're not talking about military officers, quite candidly. The bulk of the force is enlisted. The bulk of the force who transitions actually does not have a college degree. The bulk of the force segments differently. 1 out of 33 Marines retires from the military. 1 out of 4 airmen retire from the military. These are facts. And so we tend to commoditize veterans into this one general bucket. And I think when we do that, we really miss tremendous opportunities to really come to the table with solutions that matter. You know, and as a military spouse, you know, having gone, you know, I was married to an enlisted Army soldier, right? I mean, at age of 19, I mean, I have a different perspective, right? That happened all before the rest of my journey. And so I think we need to really understand who we're serving and understanding them by and large, understanding the demographics and the issue areas and making sure that we're coming to the tables with solutions that make sense for those who we're working for and with is really important, especially in the employment space, especially in the economic opportunity and civic leadership space, and in some cases understanding that if your force is married, then transition, guess what? A spouse who's employed is the biggest stabilizing hand to a transition for an active duty service member, right? Especially if they're looking at pursuing college degree and college education. And so being much more pragmatic about solutions that are focused on reality, I think is one of the biggest sometimes misconceptions in our space. I think we try and do a kind of a one-shot, one kill with some of these issues, and that just doesn't make a lot of sense when you're really looking at who we serve.
Excellent. So I got, you know, so I'm on the civic solutions side, and thank you so much for clarifying that. You know, again, I got my dog in the fight. I was an enlisted guy, and being able to explain to people what that means in today's, you know, I think, you know, if there's something that's really poisonous right now is the civilian-military divide. You know, we've been at war for a very long time, and to not understand what an IED is, to not understand these things, it's not a good place in our nation's history. And so I want to transition, because that was heavy, and rightfully so. And so let's talk about civic solutions. And really quickly, you know, we had an ideal scenario, an area in which you all think that veterans can really be impactful outside of veterans stuff. We're not going to mention veterans, helping veterans, or where veterans are at. What is a civic solution that you think veterans can be a part of that can solve some very specific problems going on in the communities in which we live? And so I'll start off, Abdul, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I'll say there's a couple things. It's always been my opinion that the post-World War II, the World War II veteran generation, because of the GI Bill, that created the middle class. Being a studier of economics and seeing that so many guys that were drafted or joined took advantage, you know, that came from rural areas where they didn't necessarily have access or capital to go to college. Then when they came back, GI Bill was there for them to actually take advantage of an opportunity that their parents didn't have. And to me, that created the middle class, because a lot of those guys got into industry, they created their own businesses, they, you know, learned enough to know about housing, finance through the housing program. They were able to buy their first house, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think as we move forward in this era is that, one, we're not producing as many veterans as we did in the past when we would have major conflicts. So we have a smaller, more specialized veteran population where their skills are specialized, and also because they're specialized also because they're much smaller. And so we need veterans to take advantage of what benefits that they have so they can take that knowledge and then garner all the training that they've acquired throughout the years and, begin to produce. Sometimes I was, when I left the Hill in 2011, I didn't work for 13 months. I went back to school, and in part, the reason I was able to go back to school is because I took advantage of the post 9/11 GI Bill, and because I was a reservist at the time I deployed, and I only deployed for 6 months when I was with the Marines, is that VA would only cover 50% of my education. I used student loans, but still, that still gave me the option to get an MBA, which I would have hated to have to take out the full amount in student loans for an MBA. And so, taking the knowledge that I've gained, and I had an option because I was just like, what do I want to do with my life? I was just like, I gained this knowledge through this MBA. My emphasis was international business, and I was like, what do I do with this knowledge? I was just like, do I go out to the private sector? Do I try to create my own? And so I'm someone that's driven by passion, and I think most veterans are driven by passion. That's what leads us to service. My passion was always trying to provide something better for someone else, and so it led me to VA, and I ended up becoming a director of international affairs at VA. And so not necessarily what I trained to do in school, but it still had components of what I did in school in it. And then through that engagement, it helped me lead to this current position that I'm in. But in the end, what I'm trying to say is that veterans need to take advantage of the opportunities that they have so they can acquire new skills, to give themselves additional options to, one, create, because actually I think veterans are primed to be business leaders. We're primed to do that. It's just some instances, a lot of folks are just having issues with finding access to capital, which is another issue in itself. But there are, some programs that are out there through Small Business Administration. There's other programs out there that can help veterans find access to capital to be business owners. And I think that is more beneficial to veterans today in thinking outside the box because, jobs are scarce for everyone, honestly. There's not a lot of jobs out there, at least the ones that are high wage, high paying jobs. There's a lot of minimum wage or low wage jobs that tend to where you have to have 2 or 3 of them to live by. And so in this new economic world where you switch jobs maybe every 2 to 5 years versus staying with someone, over the course of a lifetime, that veterans are best utilized to take advantage of kind of some of the franchising options that are out there, or some of the business and become veteranpreneurs, because that leads to true wealth in the long term.
You talk about veteranpreneurs, and I'm going to take one more question on this, and we're going to turn it over to the audience. Dana, you talked a little bit about all the unique things that military-wise bring to the table. So I'll throw this question in your boat by saying, what do you think from a solution? We talked about being a mother, running a family is like running a business and all those things. And very quickly, if you can just describe a solution that you think military spouses have for the general populace, not for veterans, but for the general populace that you think would be really interesting for you all to showcase?
Given that my husband came home back to duty about a year ago, it's taken about a year to kind of get a sense of what the transition is truly looking like. And I guess I'll frame my response maybe from the perspective from as a veteran spouse, because that's what I'm currently living now. And I think, and I had this conversation yesterday with the gentleman, Mr. Harding from Team Rubicon, as far as looking at civic health from a holistic perspective. You know, when you think about mental health and you think about fiscal health or physical health, I think it's important to also be mindful of civic health and where that kind of falls into the grander scheme of things. And I think from the perspective of a veteran spouse, sometimes we feel like we're living with our spouse who's going through the transition, and sometimes it's not going so well. And it's our responsibility to stand up and be strong and to support them through that process. But sometimes it's tough. I mean, sometimes it's really hard. And I think in thinking about from a civic solution where you could leverage veteran spouses is having opportunities for veteran spouses to come together to give back to the community, so that a veteran spouse can kind of have that sense of mission, so to speak, and that sense of camaraderie. Because I feel sometimes as a veteran spouse that you feel very isolated. There really aren't a lot of resources. I mean, as the director of outreach for our organization, I manage all of our social media. And I am constantly looking for resources for veteran spouses. And there's a caregiver program through the VA, but as far as just a support group that you can go to at the vet center, I mean, there isn't one. So as far as being kind of win-win, being able to maximize civic health for a veteran spouse, as well as to be able to give back. A solution is coming up with community service projects to be able to give back to the community, to make them healthier, and at the same time make the spouse healthier, and at the same time make the veteran healthier as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's definitely a new idea. So I'm keeping track of some tasks. I know Rosie, we'll talk a little bit after this about embedding some VA folks so the folks on the Hill know what's going on. And I don't think we've ever talked about leveraging veteran spouses as part of our infrastructure when it comes to volunteerism and things like that, because they've got some great things to bring to the table. So we're going to take a question right there. And so if you can, there's a microphone right there. So.
I'm an 8-year veteran of the Maryland Army National Guard. Did tours in Kosovo and Iraq. This past weekend, I was at a social function and started up a conversation with a person who said that they were consulting for the VA, and they made mention of current discussions on the Hill regarding the privatization of VA medical services. So if Ms. Cloud and I guess Mr. Anderson, if you two could specifically touch on those as much as you could. Or if anybody else on the panel as well, but specifically you two.
I'm definitely not going to touch that one. So. Rosie, you think you want to handle that one?
I mean, I'm actually not from the healthcare side, so I don't want to mislead you in kind of providing my own extemporaneous speech on that piece. So I'm going to defer.
And so I'll give my personal opinion. I'm not going to talk from from an opinion coming from the congressional side, but personally, I believe the privatization of the VA would be a mistake. Because one, this is another thing about what people don't know about what the VA does. And one, if you privatize it, who's going to do all the research that the VA does? You know, the VA does so much that nobody knows about. like the first liver transplant, all the research in prosthetics. You know, they've had 3 Nobel laureates. They've had like 7 of their researchers win the, I guess whatever the equivalent to the U.S. version of the Nobel laureate. Like, you know, they train most of the nurses in the country, and most of the resident doctors come out of VA facilities. Where is the private sector going to be involved in research? You know, like, what are they going to do? Where are all the nurses and trained doctors going to come from? Like, is the private sector going to pick that up? And I don't think so, because what they do is in large part, it's very profit driven. And training folks to a large degree is not part of their business model. So my personal opinion is that if the VA becomes privatized, that it would be detrimental to the institution and what it does outside of just providing care and services for veterans, like all the mental health research, you know, that they do, TBI, et cetera, it's just like a lot of that doesn't come out of DOD. You know, they work in partnership in a lot of cases, but most of the main research comes out of VA. So that's my opinion on that.
Great question. Any other questions? All right. Yes, ma'am.
So I guess I want to know what's being done to increase the presence for assisting veterans in the communities, you know, from a national level. So I take the metro every day, and for the last year and a half, I passed by the same veteran panhandling in the metro station every day, right? And so I'm sure there are VA employees that pass this same person, right? So what are we doing to help those veterans that can't help themselves, and how are we increasing our presence, right, in the neighborhood to reach out to people like him?
I'd love to take that. In fact, Lisa Pape, who works the homelessness initiative for the VA, and I are joined at the hip, because part of homelessness and eradicating homelessness actually is tied to meaningful employment in many cases, right? Especially when you're looking at our female veteran population, who tend to be much younger and with children when they actually fall into homelessness. Number one, I would say, when you look at the hundreds of millions of dollars in SSVF grants that are nationally, these are monies that are going into communities, into nonprofits and service organizations, where the rubber meets the road, so that they become complementary elements to the VA. I mean, that type of grant making is disruptive. It is meaningful, and it's actually, allows flexibility in that service organizations are able to provide much stronger proactive intervention services to all veterans in ways sometimes the VA may be limited. So I think that is one of the national initiatives that has really been very helpful. The Mayor's Challenge, we have engaged mayors across the country, especially with the highest rates of homelessness, to really help them eradicate that. The goal being by the end of this year, you've got some wonderful communities that have actually made tremendous efforts. New Orleans, New York City, I mean, where they're getting to functional zero numbers when it comes to veteran homelessness rates. And that's really a testament to not government doing it by itself, but to genuinely work with communities and civic organizations and faith-based organizations to tackle it together. So I think there's a lot of work to still be done, but I think you've seen some really good progress, from that perspective. Kind of a final initiative. Both VHA and VBA have kind of teamed up together, where under the homelessness initiative, community employment coordinators for homeless men and women are starting. 150 of them have actually been allocated in some of the most hard to serve areas where we know we have to move the needle. And then on our end, we are creating economic liaisons that are partnered with private sector employers in educating and challenging them to look for innovative ways where our homeless veterans can actually become part of competitive employment, situations. And in one model, we just stood up in Seattle, Tacoma last year. We have a coalition of employers who are saying, no boundaries. They guarantee a job for every referral that we provide to them. They're doing that as just, from a civic perspective, just saying we're going to stand up. We can take one, we can take two, we can do this one at a time. And in one coalition, they said we're going to take every female veteran with children, right? We will do that. And so really rallying all of the different dimensions of the communities to tackle it together. There's a lot more we have to do, but I do think some progress has been made over the last couple of years on that front.
Let me add something too. What I find in some cases, it also becomes issues of eligibility in terms of the veteran population. The nature of discharge can negatively impact what some veterans qualify for in terms of benefits. I've run into personal cases of friends that I have deployed with who came back and, for some reason or another began to use, drugs, self-medication as a way to cope, and then they would, pop positive on a urinalysis test, and then they would get, dishonorably discharged or other than honorable discharge, which affects their eligibility for benefits. And so, one, it has to be a better process for folks who have deployed, who have served, and then come back with issues. And then, they get dumped off to the side, and they're stuck with this bad conduct discharge or what have you. And so right now the process is, and I'm going through this, well, I've helped one friend, helped him be able to, get his discharge changed going through the DOD's process through the service branch. But I have another friend who, one, is just so depressed, because it's had such a negative impact on his life, and he's just like, this is somebody I know that he came back and he had some serious issues, and he feels that he's just like, man, I wish I never joined the Marines in some cases. Like having this discharge is really impacting my life, and I'm just like, man, brother, don't give up. Let me try to help. There's some ways, and sometimes some people just don't have the patience to deal with bureaucracy because it's a process. It's just like, man, we can try to get the nature of your discharge changed. You have records that say you've had this trauma from your experience. It's like we can probably get an upgrade for you so you can get some health care benefits, access to compensation, etc. And so a lot of cases, sometimes it's the issue of, one, can people find records to even show that they're eligible for VA benefits, the nature of the discharge. And so I think we have to do better as a community to be able to help those that did serve but not necessarily were discharged favorably. Just because you were discharged not favorably according to government standards don't mean that you should be forgotten because you did serve in combat. And I just don't think it's fair for them not to be able to have access to some type of health care because, they had some substance abuse issues once they came back from war. And so that's just kind of my take on that and how some people who tend to be homeless have these long drawn out problems. It could be some of those reasons.
Excellent. Well, we're about to close out. One thing, we got another question? I'm sorry. Oh, all right. Sorry about that.
Hi.
Oh, yes, sir.
Justin spoke to the new model of veteran service organizations such as Dog Tag Bakery, Team Rubicon, and Team Red, White, and Blue. And Dana spoke to the apparently untapped civic resource of veteran spouses and family members. I was wondering if you could briefly describe the environment that these new model service organizations have or could create in working with the old bureaucracies and working with the more formalized governmental resources in benefiting the veteran landscape.
Yeah. So hopefully I didn't come across too harsh. I have a lot of really good friends in the big VSOs, and they do great work. But we do, and I know the other organizations do also. To give you an instance, we work with Walter Reed, we work with the Warrior Transition Units, and we recruit directly out of those units. So we either get them when they're in transition, they can take they call it an internship, or we get them direct when they transition out. So we work with employment specialists and things of that nature. So we are working with the federal government. Give you another example. I did the recruitment for the first cohort, and we worked with the VA, both national and local. MAC carry on the local level. And they all sent it out. The National VA did a video for us. They also did a blog for us. The local VA sent it out on their email listserv. They also passed out flyers. And within I think 4 to 5 days, we had 114 applications. So you talk about misconceptions. One of the big misconceptions is the federal government doesn't work with local entities. The federal government works with both nonprofit and for-profit entities on a regular basis. So I think one of the challenges is, it's always a good idea when veteran service organizations work together. Sometimes they don't. It's easy to not work together when you're competing for the same funder pool. But our company policy has been work with any veteran service organization or agency that's willing to work with us. And we've had tremendous success.
We have one more. Is that right?
I would like to encourage the 4 of you to read Marching Home by Brian Matthews Jordan. It's a story of the Union veterans mustering home from the Civil War. Quite frankly, the problems aren't much different from today. And it's 150 years later. The second thing is the organization I work for has a certain job classification that we require veterans to be hired. And I wondered if you have, especially the Veterans Administration, has considered a program for supported employment. The model that I'm familiar with is people with developmentally disabled, and they have people support their employment by visiting the place of employment. And I'm wondering if you had considered a model like that. We have a very difficult time keeping veterans. We have a very difficult time with attendance. And I'm not going to say much more, but I think a program of supported employment could really help a lot.
Right, so the VHA has a compensated work therapy and supported work therapy program, and it's designed specifically for the population that you were describing, which is individuals that may have significant barriers to employment based off of either physical or mental health types of ailments. And while they are going through significant rehabilitation and support services, we partner where the VA serves as the employer. The actual employer, the employment site reimburses the VA. The VA actually takes the responsibility for the individual and provides a lot of support and training to employers across the country in order to help that. We've got thousands of veterans that are engaged in those types of employment opportunities. And then on the homelessness front, as I mentioned before, I think what we're seeing a lot more now are concerned citizens, private citizens, a coalition of the willing, if you will, of employers saying, I'm willing to support a homeless veteran or somebody that might have more barriers to employment. And so what we want to make sure is that they're prepared to be accepting and providing the right types of environment and support services, which is where that community employment coordinator becomes so important, because it does take more than just motivation. It really does take some heroes support, if you will, for some of our men and women who really want to be contributing members of society, but may just have a hard time based off of their personal disability.
All right. I think we're gonna close it up. Maynard Anderson, he's gonna finish. I'm gonna add one final part. Leave No Veteran Behind. We just hit the $3.5 million point in wages delivered to veterans, community members, and families for our transitional jobs program. And we are going to hit the 800 individuals going through our transitional jobs program, probably in mid-August. So thank you.
Well, I would only say thank you very much to each of the panelists. I think my basic conclusion from this evening is that we ought to do this about once a month, because I have a great many questions that I would like to still ask that haven't been answered. I think there were some high points, and one of them is that non-governmental organizations in collaboration and cooperation with the government today is probably the way to solve some of these problems. And that's as much of a summary as I'm going to get, because I'm cutting into your drinking time. The reception is around the corner upstairs. But once again, thanks to the sponsors, thank you very much to each of the panelists. It's been very enlightening to me. I've learned a few things which I didn't know. So thanks for coming, and stop in the lobby on your way out and have a drink.